Nowadays, gaming subscription services are kind of all the rage, but did you know that the gaming subscription service Game is not a new one? In fact, it goes all the way back to the early 90s and late 80s. Hi, I'm Ryan Turford, and this is Pit Stop Retro Gaming, your monthly dose of retro gaming goodness, where we talk about the games that defined our childhoods and what made them awesome, or in some cases, not so awesome. In the early 90s, Sega experimented with the idea of online multiplayer after being inspired by Nintendo's Famicom network system, an online attachment for the Famicom that would allow you to access cheats, weather forecasts, stocks, and even bet on horse racing for some reason. Again, it was less used as a gaming tool and more used for, delivering news and accessing the internet. You have to remember, this was the late 80s before the internet really was a thing in people's households. So it gave you a window into what was to come with the internet. Sega, being inspired by this, released the Sega MegaNet on November 3rd, 1990. It was a modem peripheral for the Mega Drive that allowed you to download specifically designed games with online play, including a new version of Columns and Flicky. When it was time to bring the service to North America, however, due to the file size restriction limiting the number of games that could be on the service at any time, because I think the final count of games that were on the service were 20, and they wanted to bring more games to the service. They wanted to expand this idea rather than, limiting it to just a couple games here. There were also other financial issues as well as a lack of demand that, made them kind of move away from the Sega MegaNet idea and kind of scrap the idea altogether. However, in 1993, Sega North America saw an opportunity to take the idea of MegaNet and use it to combat the rising game renting market by creating Sega Channel, a subscription-based service where you pay a monthly fee to have access to a library of 50 games that rotated out monthly. Sega Channel was announced in April 1993, with the initial launch happening that December, with a full rollout across the United States the following year for $15 a month. And it also came to Canada a little bit later, I think the following year, and it was for the price of 22 Canadian dollars a month, which actually, nowadays doesn't sound like a lot of money, but you have to remember this was, 1993 money before a lot of inflation happened. So it was actually quite expensive for a lot of services back then. Again, nowadays, that's kind of the price of Game Pass Ultimate that most people pay every month, or World of Warcraft subscription fees. So again, I think that this concept at that price point makes more sense nowadays, but back then this was kind of a luxury. Now, the device itself was actually a cartridge that you plugged into the top of your Sega Genesis. You didn't really screw anything in the back of your console or anything like that. The MegaNet had this special pin connector that had to connect to the back of your console, but you didn't really have to worry about that with Sega Channel. For the most part, everything was contained in the cartridge itself, because on the cartridge, you actually then plug in a coaxial cable into the side of it and you screw it in, and that's how it receives the data. So it's actually an interesting piece of technology. Unfortunately, I just don't have one here to be able to show off. I kind of wish I did, but I've got some pictures up, so you can definitely take a look at what this actually looks like. So the way this actually works is on the cartridge itself, there was actually a game on it, or I should say game in quotations, because it was essentially the menu system for Sega Channel was what was actually on the cartridge that you had in your hands. And what it would do is every time you would load up the cartridge, it would then receive new data through the cable line, and that information would update the menu system, because the games would rotate out monthly. But then you'd also have, other things on the cartridge itself that you had access to. You had access to news, you had access to cheats, and then those would update throughout the month, as well as the game's lineup itself. When you select the gear game, it'll download the game from the cable service and you'll jump right in eventually after it loads, because this is one of the things about Sega Channel that unfortunately, was a problem of the time. If anyone remembers using the internet in the early 90s, and it would take forever to do just about anything, because even just to load a picture on the internet sometimes would take, 15 to 20 minutes. So try imagining downloading a full game through your internet service. Even though the games themselves were only, a couple hundred kilobytes in size, sometimes it would just take half an hour to load the game. It just depends on how big the game was. Also, certain games were edited specifically for content reasons to actually be able to be reliably downloaded on the service. A big one was actually Mortal Kombat 3, where they actually split the game into kind of two halves, depending on what characters you wanted to play as. So you would actually download the game in two parts, depending on what characters you wanted access to in Mortal Kombat 3, which is just a crazy idea to me. The fact that they would, split a game like that in half just for you to be able to download it is just kind of crazy to me. Like I mentioned before, there are actually more than just games on the service. You had access to a cheats menu, a news section that would talk about upcoming games coming to Sega Channel or upcoming Sega releases. And you also had what was really interesting for the time, demos of unreleased games. And actually the demos that we got, some of them were of actual games that came out, like Sonic 3 is a good one. In fact, there were some, levels that were cut from the game that you actually could play via Sega Channel, which was just kind of weird at the time to think about. But then you also had, there were games in development that would have their demo, like their levels provided to Sega for demos, but just never came out. So some in release games, we actually got to play that way as well. Sega also wanted to have exclusive games on Sega Channel because they thought that would actually be a good way of selling the Sega Channel. So we actually had Treasure's Alien Soldier, Games Freak Pulse Man, and Capcom's Mega Man, The Wily Wars. None of these games really got physical releases here in North America. They did in other territories, but they were exclusive to Sega Channel in North America, meaning the only way to play these games was if you had a subscription to Sega Channel. But it also meant kind of like what we saw with Google Stadia, where, once the service shuts down, those games were lost to time for the longest time. Like Mega Man, The Wily Wars, as an example, was the Sega port of, the first three Mega Man games done in 16-bit style, kind of like Super Mario All-Stars. So it was actually like a super cool idea for a game that unfortunately just kind of got scrapped. In fact, all three of these exclusive games were great. I mean, Alien Soldier, great game from Treasure. Not as good as something like Gunstar Heroes, but pretty darn good game. And then Pulse Man was actually a really good game from Game Freak. Just came to Nintendo Switch Online, thankfully, so people are actually getting a chance to finally play it now. Although it was also on the Wii Virtual Console for the longest time as well. But it was just crazy to think about these games just being lost forever. I know that reproduction cartridges were very popular for these games in particular. And luckily we've had them released in other collections. I know Alien Soldier has been in a bunch of different, Sega collections. Wily Wars got its own physical release from Retrobit. And then Pulse Man, again, was on the Wii channel. Now it's on, Nintendo Switch Online. In fact, all three of these, I think, are on Nintendo Switch Online at this point, at the time of this recording. So at least we got these games kind of preserved. And these were kind of the heavy hitters of the exclusive games for Sega Channel. But again, the library itself was pretty big. And actually, I had Sega Channel as a child. Like my brother Kyle and I, we were playing so many games, and we were burning through so many games, like whether it was rentals or games that our parents bought for us either on our birthdays or for Christmas. So our parents decided to actually get us Sega Channel and get us that subscription because I think they wanted to, cut down on the fees that we were paying for video games every single month. And, Kyle and I, we went through the service and played almost every single game on the service, and it allowed us to discover a bunch of new games we probably wouldn't have played otherwise. I know, for example, I talked about this on the RPG Cave, but my window into RPGs was actually thanks to Sega Channel because we had kind of a bad experience with Genghis Khan on the NES. We rented it once and didn't like it. And when we returned it to the video rental store, we asked, what kind of game is this? Because we've never played a game like this before. And we want to know kind of to stay away from this genre of games, to not pick up anything similar to that. And the clerk was like, oh yeah, it's an RPG. So we thought, okay, all RPGs were like Genghis Khan on the NES, when that's not the case, because Genghis Khan was actually a, Romance of the Three Kingdoms style, strategy game. So we actually thought, all RPGs were bad, but when we got Sega Channel, we got exposed to other RPGs, things like Phantasy Star or Shining Force in particular. Shining Force 2 was actually the game that, really got me into RPGs. I played it a ton on Sega Channel. And from there, my RPG journey kind of continued onward after trying more stuff on Sega Channel. We also then got, the Sega CD attachment around that time. So we were playing stuff like Lunar on Sega CD and whatnot. So it's all thanks to Sega Channel that I, continued to play RPGs rather than, blowing them off as all being like, Genghis Khan on NES, which is just funny to think about. But Sega Channel really, again, exposed me to so many more games that I normally wouldn't have had exposure to. In fact, I had the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis both at the same time. And a lot of people, wonder why I turned out to be more of a Sega kid despite having the Super Nintendo. And honestly, Sega Channel, again, had a lot to do with that as well, where, I just had exposure to so many more games on Genesis versus Super Nintendo that I ended up just being more of a Genesis guy because of it. At its peak, Sega Channel had an install base of over 250,000 subscribers, though the downfall of the Sega Channel unfortunately wasn't really a problem with the service itself, but was more the release of the Sega Saturn in 1995. In order to help the Sega Saturn succeed, Sega of Japan halted support for pretty much all the Genesis devices, including the Genesis itself, Sega CD, 32X, and of course the Sega Channel, which also led to the downfall of the 32X. In fact, that'll actually probably be another video at some point, is the history of the 32X, because I actually think the 32X is like a really interesting story and a really interesting piece of hardware that we can, again, talk about at a later date, where, 6 months after the 32X came out, Sega of Japan decided, hey, we need to help the Sega Saturn that we just stealth dropped in stores in 95. So we need to just cut support for everything. And that, kind of killed, anything Genesis related at that point. But the crazy thing about Sega Channel is it actually lasted well after they initially expected it to fail. I mean, there was waning interest in the service, obviously, over time, because it really wasn't getting the support that it needed. But Sega Channel did actually last until July 31st, 1998, where they finally shut off the service and kind of called it a day. Even when the service closed down, though, there were still, close to 200,000 people subscribed to it. So I think that, the subscriber base for Sega Channel was actually pretty high. I think the demand for a service like this was pretty strong. Again, I feel like, even though I talked about it a little bit earlier, where I feel like, it felt expensive at the time. I also think, the price proposition for games at the time, when you consider how much games were, in the mid 90s to late 90s, I actually think the price for Sega Channel was really good when you kind of compare, what you were getting on the service versus how much games actually cost at the time. And I mean, yes, it made sense to close it in, 1998 because, the PlayStation was out, Dreamcast was going to come out the next year. So of course it just made perfect sense to kind of sunset it at that time. But honestly, they probably could have kept it going for a while, especially in emerging countries like Brazil, where Sega itself was becoming more and more popular. Like the Genesis, as an example, was a system that consistently sold through pretty much until the PlayStation 2 came out, where it was really just a game that sold way more than they were expecting, even after they stopped selling Genesises in other regions. But all in all, that's kind of my look at the Sega Channel and kind of its entire history. I really think the Sega Channel was ahead of its time because, again, you can definitely see it, the roots of Sega Channel in the DNA of services like Xbox Game Pass or PlayStation Plus, where I really think like services like that really benefited from Sega Channel existing and were really inspired by that idea of having, one monthly subscription service where you had access to a whole bunch of different games. I think, again, modern, services really owed a lot to Sega Channel. And again, just super ahead of its time. Sega was just a really forward-thinking company at the time, trying a bunch of different stuff, trying CD technology on their consoles well before it was kind of proven, trying, a handheld console with full color and a backlit screen. Just unfortunately, they were so forward-thinking with the Game Gear, as an example, that, it required so many batteries that it, didn't really serve its portable needs. They were really an innovative company back then. And I just love to see stuff like that. So Sega Channel, really awesome. And yeah, I hope that y'all learned a little bit something about this. I'm Ryan Turford, and of course, this has been Pit Stop Retro Gaming. Of course, if you like the video, please like the video. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, because what are you doing if you haven't subscribed already? And then also let me know in the comments below what you think about Sega Channel. Did you have Sega Channel growing up? Did you know someone who had it? What did you think about Sega Channel? I would love to hear from you. And of course, last but not least, turn on that notification bell to be notified whenever we go live and we're going to put up a new video like this one. Well, until that next time, friends, I'm out.